Hello everybody, I'm back and I finally get to fill my nails. I'm so excited. If you're new here, welcome to the Nail Coven. Today I am going to be filling my nails and we will be discussing the latest book, and that book is The City of Gold and Lead, part of the Tripod Trilogy that I started recently, a few weeks back, by John Christopher. All right, so I'm going to start with prepping the nails and pushing back the cuticles. So I'm just gonna pull out everything I need right now so I'm not making a bunch of noise. Okay, so The City of Gold and Lead by John Christopher. This book is the second book in the Tripod Trilogy. It is a series for young adults. The first time I had read the first book, The White Mountains, I have covered already in previous videos, and I will link those before. I will link those below if you haven't seen them and you're interested in this book. You might want to watch those first, only because it could spoil some things for the first one. So, letting you know ahead of time, spoiler alerts. The book starts with Will in the White Mountains. He's describing a typical day for him there. He says that the preparations for the siege have begun. That, they had started planning this long before he showed up. A typical day for himself there is a lot of exercising, studying, and training in his particular sport. In the evenings, the older men of the community sit around and talk a lot. The boys Will's age don't presume to join in on these conversations. No, they're too young. So they just sit around and listen. And the conversation is always about one thing, and that is the tripods. Will tells us that the tripods have been around for about 100 years, that they control the minds of people through metal caps that they are forced to put on in their 14th year. He tells us that, he had not wanted to be capped. So after he met a vagrant named Ozymandias, who was actually not a vagrant, but went around to towns and villages looking for young men and women who were open-minded, self-thinkers, and not yet capped, to recruit them for living in the White Mountains and ultimately trying to defeat the tripods. So he escaped to the White Mountains along with his cousin Henry and a boy named Jean-Paul that they met along the way. They call him Beanpole, though, because he's tall and skinny and, they're boys and they like to make fun of each other. They met Jean-Paul, or Beanpole, in France, so I was right. It was France. So they continued across the sea to the White Mountains where men were still free. Will tells us about what he calls his training group. There are 11 in his group, and they're being prepared to move against their enemies, the tripods. The mission was to be sent, that they were going to select boys Will's age to be sent on a reconnaissance mission because they knew very little about the tripods, men did. And how can you defeat an enemy you know nothing about, right? So as we kind of know already, in each land, in different ways, people are chosen to serve the tripods, to go to their city and serve the tripods. We know this from the last book when they were at the Comtesse de la Toulouge's kingdom, and Eloise got selected at the tournament to be the queen of the tournament. And then after that, she was sent to the city of the tripods to be a servant. And she had felt this was a great honor, whereas Will was like, are you nuts? You don't want to do that. But she was just like, oh, Will, you just don't understand because you're not capped yet, and you will once you're capped. And Will was like, oh, screw this, and he took off. Now, that was in the land of France, and they are now in the land of Germany, outside of it some. The city of the tripods is located in Germany. The way they select donations to the city of the tripod is they have a series of games that mostly young men compete in. This happens each summer, and the boys are going to try and qualify to be in these games so that maybe they can get selected to go to the city to be a servant, and there they will collect information that they can hopefully bring back to the men of the White Mountains to hopefully be used against the tripods. Now, hopefully, they will be able to come back. They are honestly not too hopeful on the idea, because while hundreds of people are selected to go into the city every year to serve them, no one's ever heard of anybody coming out. So one day, Will and Henry and Beanpole, who are, very close now because of everything that they went through, they're up sitting on like this little lookout point in the mountains. You can see down into the valleys where all the normal people live, and they're talking about how they're doing in their different categories, and they're also speaking in German to practice, because these games are going to be taking place in Germany. This is how German boys are selected, so they are going to be pretending that they're German, and you can't really do that if you don't speak the language. They've been studying the language, and now they're just like practicing anytime they can. And they're talking about how each one of them are doing in their selected training groups. Beanpole was training in the long and high jumping, Henry in long distance running, and Will in boxing. And each one of them very much wanted an opportunity to go to the games and be selected to enter the city. They were all very much dedicated to this plan and wanted to contribute to it. Now, there is a man in their community named Julius. He is the leader, basically, and he's also the one that will be choosing which boys will be going to the games for a chance to enter the Tripod City. So one day, a raiding group, because that's how they get their food and supplies and stuff, is they'll go down into the valleys and raid the villages for food, supplies. And one day when one of these raiding parties comes back, they were able to bring home about a half a dozen black and white cows. So Julius had them butcher one for a feast. Everyone comes to the main part of the cave, because they live in the mountains and they live in caves and stuff. And they come all together in their main communal area in the cave, and they have this feast. And Julius stands up and starts giving a speech. And Will realizes that, oh, this is going to be the announcement on who's going to the games. And he gets nervous. And at first he's just talking about, the plan in general, about the games and how they're, training and selecting boys. I keep calling them boys. In this book, they're not really considered boys anymore. They're considered, by 14, they're men. So Julius is telling everyone how they're going to be selecting 3 participants to go to these games in Germany. Now, Germany is about, a few hundred miles away from them. And whoever is chosen would be taken there along the river on a barge owned by one of them. It would get them, close enough so that they could easily make the rest of the trip on foot. Will is getting very excited as it seems like Julius is getting closer and closer to announcing who it's going to be. And Julius does. He announces that it's going to be Will, Beanpole, and another boy named Fritz, who they didn't know so well. This was, a little disheartening to some degree, only because Henry did not get selected. And they were all pretty confident in Henry being selected because Henry's, he's very, big for his age and did good in his category. So they're not really sure why he didn't get selected. And you can tell that Henry is, upset by this. And they kind of just, leave him alone. Like, okay, well, he's in a bad mood. Let's not bother him right now. So the day comes to leave. The boys had a guide from one of the raiding parties take them to where this barge that they were going to take to the games would be. Now, the barge that the boys were to take was manned by 2 men. The captain was, please excuse my German, Ulf, I think is how you say his name. And his assistant was Moritz. Ulf was kind of a tough guy. He told the boys that having one apprentice on the barge would be normal, but more than that would kind of draw attention. So they would have to take turns staying below deck while the other one was above deck pretending to be an apprentice. And he warned them that if there was any messing around, he had no problem just dropping them off. He's assuming Julius, spoke to them about being disciplined and, they are considered men now, but really they are still adolescents, and you know how adolescents can be. They like to screw around. So anyway, he warned them that he had no problems dropping them off somewhere if they acted up. That was their warning. So at about the halfway point of this journey on the barge, they stopped at a small town because Ulf had some business to take care of. And he said it wouldn't take long and that, the boys and Moritz should just hang out on the ship until he was done. And they were, ahead of schedule anyway, so it wasn't like a big deal. But when Ulf didn't arrive, come back when Moritz expected him to, you could see that Moritz was nervous. And he tells the boys that, Ulf kind of has this little problem with, drinking, and he's been known to get behind schedule because he decided to stop off for some drinks and then got drunk and kind of put their little operation behind schedule. And he was nervous that this might be happening now. And now it was sundown. Moritz was extremely nervous that they were losing time. So Beanpole convinced Moritz to let him go look for him, since Moritz couldn't just leave the boys on the barge. One, because, I mean, what if something happened? They have no idea how to handle situations on a barge. That, and Ulf and Moritz were known in this town. And if, visitors stopped by, which they had been, to say hello, and, a conversation about barging came up and the boys didn't know the answer, it would raise some suspicion. Beanpole leaves to go look for Ulf and try to bring him back, or at the very least, figure out where he is, and then Moritz can quickly go and get him. But Will had kind of wanted to go and try to find Ulf too. He thought it would be faster if there was two looking, and he convinces Moritz to let him go too. But Moritz was like, he should be back within the hour regardless if he found Ulf or not. So Will goes into town. In town, it's market day. There's a lot of activity going on. And Will is, going through the town, and he's looking in the windows of a few taverns, but he does not see Ulf. He found another tavern, but it was very dark and you couldn't really see inside through the window. So he actually had to go into the tavern to see if Ulf was possibly there. So he went inside, and with some money of that land that Beanpole had given him, he bought a stein of ale. He did not see Ulf, so he, didn't really bother drinking the drink, and he goes to leave. And as he goes to walk out, he heard a voice call after him. He, had forgotten his change. It was the bartender. The bartender also made a comment about Will not finishing his drink, what, did you not like it? And Will just, made up an excuse that, oh, no, it was great. He's just, not feeling well. So he's gonna go. And then the bartender asked him where he was from, noticing his accent. Will told him he was from a town a few miles away called, forgive me again, Triol. I'm just gonna call it Triol because I don't know, it's Tirol. Triol. Now apparently, Will didn't know this, but people in this town did not like those from Triol. At the games the year prior, a contestant from Triol had beat the contestant from this town. And there was some, insinuating of cheating going on by the member, or by the contestant from Triol. So the people in the tavern began hurling insults at Will. He ignored them and he went to just leave, but was tripped by one of the tavern patrons. And Will banged his knee pretty hard on the ground, and this kind of pissed him off. But he got up to leave, and a hand grabbed his hair and shook him back and forth, and then hurled him to the ground. When he got up, a boy about a year older than him was standing over him grinning, and the two of them began fighting. But with Will being, kind of an expert boxer, quickly knocked him out. Now, after he won this fight, he expected for, the crowd that had formed to part ways and let him go. But that's not what happened. Somebody, went over to the boy who had been knocked out and, was checking on him and was like, he is hurt pretty badly. You should call the cops. So the magistrate came and threw Will in a pit. I guess that's a way they punish prisoners there. They throw him in a pit. Now, apparently, Will found out later that the boy he had knocked out and apparently given a concussion was the magistrate's nephew. So, wrong person to get in a fight with and win. So Will's in this pit now. It's nighttime, and Will was getting cold. He, begins to curse himself. He's pissed at himself for getting himself in this situation. As he was, kind of about to fall asleep in the pit, he heard Beanpole whisper at the top of the pit. He brought a rope from the barge to help Will out of the pit. And the sun was just starting to come up by now. The two boys ran through the town after, Beanpole was able to get Will out of the pit. So they're running back to the barge, but when they get there, it was gone. They looked down the river and there it was, sailing away. I don't think a barge sails, because there's no sails. What does it do? Anyway, it was leaving. So the boys started down the river, walking down the bank of the river, following the barge as it got smaller and smaller till it disappeared. And a heavy rain begins, and they take refuge in some ruins. This is where Beanpole told Will what happened. How Beanpole figured out that Will was there and that he had to come and get him. So Beanpole never found Ulf, and he went back to the barge. And Ulf was there and furious that Beanpole and Will had left the barge. An acquaintance of Ulf's had stopped by and told him about an incident with a boy from Trio, and it landed him in the pit. Now Ulf assumed that this was Will and decided that Will was a liability to this mission, and if he was not back by morning, they would continue on their way without him. So then Beanpole asked Moritz a bunch of questions, trying to figure out where this pit was so that he could go and get Will. Now, Beanpole wasn't sure if Moritz, caught on to, his line of questioning and was okay with it, or if he just was oblivious. So at the first light, Beanpole grabbed a rope and headed to where he thought the pit was. And that's when he was able to get Will. So they figured that, obviously Ulf had woken and seen now Beanpole gone too, and was like, screw these kids. They're causing too much trouble. We're moving on. So after about a day of them walking in the rain, trying to catch up to the barge, they were just like, you know what, this is hopeless. There's no way that they're going to be able to catch up to something that can move so much faster than them. They needed to figure out a way how to get down the river on their own and not try to rely on catching the barge. So they were sleeping in this little hut, and they were like, you know what, in the morning, let's pull down one of these hut walls and make a raft out of it, and then we'll just go down the river ourselves. So they pulled the side of this hut down and secured it, and then dragged it down to the riverbank. It floated, but just barely. They got on it, and under the weight, it kind of, all but one of the corners were under the water. It was pretty janky. So after about an hour on the raft, they started to get hungry. And this is when they realized, they kind of forgot about having a way to steer the raft. So if they wanted to get off the raft and go on to land to try and find some food, they'd have to abandon the raft, and then they wouldn't have their transportation anymore. So they realized, okay, we got to figure this out. They decided, well, let's just stay on the raft until we find habitation. Then we'll get off the raft and figure it out. So they're going along the river and they see a tripod. And they're like, oh my God, we haven't seen one of these in a while. And the fear that it invokes suddenly comes up and they're like, great, what's gonna happen? And they're surprised, happily, when the tripod just kind of passes them by. All of a sudden, it makes a sharp turnaround, like it noticed them or something, and decided to come back and mess with them. And all of a sudden, a huge tentacle comes crashing down on them, and it destroys their raft. All of a sudden, they're in the water. Now, the tripod kind of, after it destroyed their raft, just went about its business, like it just wanted to mess with them. They're floating in the water. They're like struggling against the current because it's moving super fast. Will's struggling to keep his head above water, and he's looking around for Beanpole, and then he grabs onto one of the planks of the raft and he's looking around, and then he sees Beanpole pop up, and Beanpole grabs onto the raft, and they see a fork in the river coming up. So there's some land kind of, dividing it. So they go and try to get to this land. And as they're struggling, suddenly everything goes black. And then the next thing he knows is that he's feeling his body being dragged, and he can feel gravel and the ground underneath his body. So he comes to, and it's Beanpole dragging him onto this area of land that they were trying to get to. And they stand up, kind of look around, and they're like, well, we might have to stay here for the night because, it's getting dark and we're exhausted from just what happened, and they don't want to, try to deal with that right now. They go to where there's some trees to get a little shelter, and they notice there's a man watching them, and he's kind of poorly dressed, like kind of in, not rags, but, not nice clothes. He's seen them. He's got long hair. His hairline is receding. And then they notice he's not capped. What the heck? How's this possible, right? And the man sees that they see him. So he steps forward and he's like, you guys are going to need some shelter and food. Why don't you come with me? They also realize at this time that it wasn't a fork in the river that they saw. It was that they're actually on an island. So they follow him to a hut. He starts making them some food. He gives them some dry clothes and they change. And he tells them that his name is Hans. So the boys start chowing down because they were starving. After they ate, Beanpole just couldn't help himself and he just blurts out, why aren't you capped? And his answer was, I never bothered. And Will's thinking in his head, never bothered. That kind of annoyed Will because it's like, here they are struggling to not have to be capped. And this guy's just like, whatever, I didn't bother. So he tells them the story of when he was a kid. His mom died and his dad brought him to this island and they just lived there and worked the land. His dad then died before his capping age. He's just a kid. He doesn't know how to go about getting capped, nor did he even think about it really. So he stayed there, by himself and worked the land. He made little trinkets, and once or twice a year he would go into the villages to sell them. No one ever really said anything because he wasn't technically really part of their community. He didn't make trouble, so people just didn't really notice him. And if they did, they just, didn't bother with him. Like you said, didn't bother. He's too busy doing other things. And so were the people of the villages that he met to concern themselves. But I guess, if he had made trouble, he would, most certainly get capped. So Beanpole started, kind of asking more questions of him and kind of trying to figure out where his head was at as far as like how he felt about the tripods. And he basically just had like an indifferent feeling about them. He was like, they don't really seem to cause any harm. They ruin crops here and there from stepping on them, but other than that, it's no big deal. He said it didn't seem like the caps on the people were, any big deal either. He was just like, whatever. It's just something in the life. He's like, I don't participate in it just because I never had, but other than that, no biggie. Beanpole and Will are just like thinking in their heads, no biggie. It's huge biggie. Huge. And so Hans tells them, you better stay here tonight. Why don't you guys stay here, rest up, and tomorrow there's some work I need done around his farm that he hasn't been able to get to because he has a bad shoulder. He needs some wood chopped. And that would be payment for them staying at his place and the food that they ate. And so the boys are like, okay, that sounds fair. And then he said when they're done, he would take them in his boat to the closest village. So the next morning, they wake up to Hans cooking, and he made them a huge breakfast, and then he takes them to where this wood needs to be chopped. So they've been chopping for, a good part of the day. Hans comes and checks on them and brings them some lunch and is like, I kind of thought you would have been farther along. Well, that's fine. You can finish tomorrow. Then walks away. And Will and Beanpole are like, tomorrow? They're like, we need to get going here, They need to get to the game soon. They're going to be starting. So the boys, now they're alone. So they're like, what are we going to do? Beanpole's like, you know what? He's like, he's not ever intending on taking us to a village because he wants all this work finished. He's just going to keep feeding us and telling us that we owe him something for the food. But we have to eat to continue working and on. And it's going to be this big thing that makes it so that they can never leave. They're like, crap, we gotta leave. We need a boat. So they decide to steal his boat. And they feel kind of bad about it, but it's just like, hey, what they have to do here is much more important to the whole planet. So sorry about your boat. They're like, we need to go right now. So they kind of nonchalantly start making their way to the boat. And then as they got closer, then they run and they hop in the boat and they get the oars and they make it out to midstream. Hans discovers this and he comes running out, cursing the boys, but he doesn't get to them. They're long gone by then and they're making their way down the river. So the boys are on this boat for a few days and they finally come to where the games are. They've made it to their destination. The town is beautifully decorated with banners. There's a festival feeling in the air, and the boys go to where they have to qualify for the games, and they all do very easily. And then after that, they are taken to where they will be staying for the duration of the games, and they're fed, and they're super happy about that because they were hungry. They're also weighed there, and this is where they come across Fritz. And Fritz, didn't really seem surprised to see them, oddly enough. They thought he would have been like, whoa, where'd you guys come from? I thought you were stuck in that town where you got in trouble. So the next day was the opening ceremonies. They awaken to this tripod standing perfectly still in the town. Kind of like they had when they were in France at that tournament, and how there was that tripod just kind of standing over everybody watching, or it seemed like they were. There was actually 6 tripods just standing there in silence at these games. So all the competition begins, and basically, long story short, Will wins his category and is chosen to go to the city of the tripods. But Beanpole is not. But Fritz is. Will is sad that he won't be there with Beanpole, his comrade. At least he won't be there completely alone. At least, he'll know somebody that's, on the same page. So the next day is the ceremony of the farewell, where the winners of the games are taken by the tripods. Oh, it's okay, baby. That was me. I'm so sorry. To the city, where they will be serving their masters. And they divide all the winners up into groups. They're in 6 groups. The tripods, they step forward, and the first group is taken up into their tripod. Each person is grabbed by the tentacle and taken up into the mouth of the hemisphere. Take a turn going up into the tripod. And then it's Will's turn. And the tentacle comes down and picks him up. And Will is kind of half expecting to black out once he goes up into the tripod, simply because when he was taken up into the tripod, in the last book, everything went black when he entered. But apparently he finds out later, this is because, when they grabbed him, he was uncapped. And only the uncapped would kind of maybe freak out about this, since the capped loved the tripods and saw them as gods and would be very happy to go up into a tripod and not freak out. He kind of had to pretend that he was super happy to be taken up into the tripod, kind of like how everyone else was acting. So inside the hemisphere, there are these little 7 by 7 cells, and Will is put into one. So after a minute, the whole tripod floor begins to rock back and forth, so they can tell that they have started their journey to the city. There were little porthole windows in the sides of their cells, and they all go and look out these portals to see what's happening. After a while, they see the city coming up, and there's a river that leads into it on one side and leads out on another. It's got a big greenish crystal dome, and the base of it is this gold wall. The wall is about 3 times as high as the tripod, so it is very, very tall. A slit opens up in the side of this golden wall, and the first tripod in the party goes inside, and then Will's tripod goes in. And as soon as the tripod enters the city, Will feels this enormous weight come from above and push him to the ground, and he can barely move, especially his limbs, and it just is such a heavy weight. The hemisphere door opens, and a tentacle reaches inside and starts grabbing the new slaves. And then a tentacle comes in and grabs Will. And they're all put into this room. It's just like a vast hall, and they're all just kind of standing around what's happening? And they're all just waiting to see what's going to happen. Okay, these are filled. So all we have to do is file and do our design work. And just like Will is waiting to see what's going to happen next, you are going to have to wait too, because we are going to do that in another video. So if you liked this video, make sure and let me know by giving it a thumbs up. It helps me decide what kind of videos to make. Make sure and subscribe and hit the notifications bell so you don't miss what happens with Will and the tripods and the city of golden lead. I will see you in the next one. Bye.